So we've got another video here for you guys going over our Ignite student devotions. We're still in the book of Romans, and this question actually comes out of Romans 6. Specifically, we're going to look at verses 16 through 19 because they really kind of highlight a concept that is a little bit difficult to understand at first glance, because Paul seems to be talking about some things that just seem a little bizarre for this passage. And when you read over it quickly, it may not even make sense. So I just wanted to spend some time because I did have a question about this specific section and hopefully explain it a little bit so that you guys would be able to understand it. But I'm just going to read it for you. So I'm in Romans 6. We're going to look at verses 16 through 19. And it says, "Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or of obedience resulting in righteousness? But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed. And having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. I am speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, resulting in further lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, resulting in sanctification." So this whole section dealing with slaves and what you're a slave to can be very difficult. And in particular, the question stems out of the 19th verse, which says, "I am speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh." This statement is very odd for Paul to make, and it really kind of can cause a lot of confusion. So let's try to unpack this a little bit more and determine what Paul is saying. So what Paul is essentially trying to say is you are going to serve something, right? We all do. We either serve our own flesh, which is our sin nature as human beings, or we are slaves to righteousness or to God, and we take on more and more of his nature. And so one of those two things is happening for everybody, regardless of if you have a relationship with God or not. And so what this passage is trying to say is this, that if you are a slave to sin, if you are constantly turning to sin, and if you are not a believer, not a follower of Christ, your life will typically be one that consistently follows a pattern of sin. So sin is going to consistently be your pattern. And so you're going to come deeper and deeper into sin, right? And it may progress, and it's going to slowly drag you in and progress, and you're going to become more and more like your human nature, the flesh, or more and more like your sin nature. The flip side that Paul is saying is if you are a slave to righteousness, or if you're pursuing Christ, then the opposite should be happening in your life, and you should be becoming more and more like Christ, right? So the longer the time goes on, the more you spend time in his word and in prayer and in growing in the knowledge of him, you become more and more pure, more and more righteous, right? And so he's giving that distinction here. And so this is where verse 19 steps into play. And it says, "I am speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh." So this is kind of where Paul is saying, I'm giving you a metaphor. I'm giving you something that isn't perfect, right? Because here's the deal. We are sinful people by nature. And so until we leave this earth and until we spend eternity with God, we are forever going to be hindered by our sinful nature. We can never measure up and become someone who is perfect and holy and righteous, just like Jesus Christ was. We can live a life, though, that constantly leads to that purity and towards that righteousness and holiness, where it is more marked by our constant striving for righteousness than our striving for sin. Okay, so Paul is essentially saying, this example, while it works in explaining this concept, it's not a perfect example because it does have human fallibles, nature to it, where it doesn't work because it's not exactly something where we can ever attain perfect righteousness. That's only something that Christ obtained on this earth, and we will obtain once we spend eternity with him. And so if we continue that in verse 19, it says, "For just as you presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, resulting in further lawlessness, so now present your members as slave to righteousness, resulting in sanctification." So what it's saying is, your sin, if you are constantly a slave to sin, your sin is going to lead to more sin. And if you are a slave to righteousness, or if you are striving after God, seeking purity and holiness and righteousness, as you walk into that, that is going to become the trend in your life, right? That is going to be the general direction that you are holding to. And so what Paul is saying is, don't become a slave to sin, because a slave to sin, a spot here, could end up drifting you all the way to over here. He's saying instead, become a slave to righteousness. Because when you begin to live a righteous life, you are going to exemplify Christ more and more and more as you grow. And so keep in mind, it's not a perfect example, and even Paul admits that in this passage. But it does hopefully help us see how we should be living and what we should be striving for as Christians and as believers, to be living a life that is righteous, to be striving after that, and to be slaves to righteousness and not slaves to sin. I hope this answers your question a little bit more and gives you a little bit better insight into this couple verses here in Romans. Thank you guys so much for watching.